Welcome, everyone. I believe we're live. I'm Dr. Salim Afshar, the Chief Medical and Innovation Officer at Reveal HealthTech. And it's my pleasure to host today's conversation, Translating AI into Impact, from Vision to Implementation. As many of you know, the promise of AI in healthcare is often talked about, but too rarely realized. Bridging that gap between vision and implementation requires more than technology. It demands clarity of purpose, thoughtful leadership, and trusted collaboration. Today, I'm joined by my colleague and co-host, Alexis Isabelle. She's the Vice President of Business Solutions here at Reveal HealthTech, and she has led several of our most complex implementation efforts. And she has worked closely with today's guests over the past 2 years through our partnership with Genentech. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Santosh shortly. He just had a difficulty, so we'll just continue chatting. When we talk about implementation, we often think of the tangible steps of like building the data infrastructure, validating models, addressing compliance. But when we think about translating, it's about making AI meaningful across the organization in your context. And that goes beyond just the technical aspects. It's around aligning the leadership, the technical teams, the operational stakeholders, but it's more than alignment. It's about creating sustained translation, which is building a culture, a new mindset that ensures early buy-in to the execution, the iteration, and adoption. And it's not about failing to deliver impact. It's about creating a culture of learning and experimentation in the organization. Santosh, who is our guest today, welcome, is a wonderful partner. He's the Director of AI and Machine Learning at Genentech. He leads the NLP measurement sciences and is deeply focused on the meaningful application of AI across the enterprise. He is about building trust with leadership and about articulating a clear vision. He plays a central role in moving AI solutions from pilot to production. He's not only a technical leader, but a strategic partner, one who brings a deep understanding of both science and organizational change. Santosh, Alexis, welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salim. I'm really glad to be here and really welcome the opportunity to speak with both you and Alexis. Looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. Alexis, welcome.
Thank you. So nice to be here. And Santosh, so nice to see you outside of our day-to-day. It's great to be able to talk at a higher level about all the amazing things that you've been doing.
Santosh, I was thinking, in your view, maybe we could talk about what are the biggest shifts you've seen in the world of AI, ML, and NLP in the healthcare space, and what it takes, what you've been doing from moving this from proof of concept to real world impact.
Yeah, it's a great question. So before I actually begin, just a quick disclaimer, the opinions and thoughts that I'm expressing are just my own and do not represent the official position of Genentech or any of the Roche affiliates. Now, with that out of the way, that's a great question. So from my vantage point, Dr. Salim and Alexis, this space has gone through multiple paradigm shifts, right? So not so long ago, harnessing insights from unstructured data was mostly in the realm of what I would call as traditional NLP techniques. So mostly text processing, hand engineering features from the text that you're basically kind of layering on some domain expertise, and then applying those features to classical machine learning algorithms like clustering or classification algorithms to generate insights. And so you basically had these, custom or bespoke models for each specific task. And the performance was not necessarily where it is today, right? So you still had to make do with what you had at that time. And then, with the advent of transformers and Hugging Face and other platforms like that, I think it really democratized these powerful pre-trained language models to everyone. And then the whole paradigm shifted to like, how do you use these pre-trained models, how do you download them, and then maybe potentially even fine-tune them on your domain specific data. And so that ended up becoming the norm of how insights were generated from unstructured data. And I think we're witnessing another shift in the paradigm now with the advent of frontier models or foundation models. And so now you have like these really large kind of like LLMs that are really adept at many different NLP tasks. So you don't really have this custom model kind of issue anymore. And now a lot of the work I've seen is around how do you build kind of large scale enterprise level applications using these LLMs and maybe even some of the open source frameworks like LangChain. And so in all of this, even though the technology has greatly changed over a short span of time, I think the promise of generating value from data, whether it's structured or unstructured, is still the same. And so that's the common thread. It's just the technology and the medium of generating insights that has really kind of undergone some significant transformations.
Interesting. You just covered a lot of ground, and I'm curious. In the past, a lot of this work, sometimes done in the shadows of, the leading data science, data engineers, and the research teams, and thinking about this. But today, you have people at the board level and in different areas who don't actually have much, say, background on the kind of the evolution, asking about, hey, can we use AI in our context? How can we leverage AI? So can you talk about that reality that you have since post ChatGPT, where the demand and the kind of the expectations from non-technical leaders, from business units are coming, and how you manage that at enterprise level?
Yeah, that's a great
general patterns, right? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think a lot of that demand is stemming from the fact that AI and ML in general now has become a general purpose technology, right? So it's no longer customized to like very specific use cases. Like Gen AI now has almost become a universal technology where you can apply it to pretty much a lot of problems or across a range of industries. And so I think that's where a lot of that demand comes from, to say, hey, are we actually falling behind if we're not capitalizing on this Gen AI kind of concept, and how do we actually bring this to life in our enterprises or in our kind of day-to-day operations? And so I feel like that's where a lot of that demand comes from. And then if you hear in the news or like all of the discussion forums and such, I think that's all the buzz there is today, right? I think there is a lot of conversation around Gen AI and how organizations and enterprises can really harness the power of this technology to drive productivity or drive business value. The approach that I think is generally prudent for enterprises, large and small companies, whatever it may be, to follow is really taking a kind of a systematic approach to defining the problem statement, and then understanding and prioritizing what is the right problem for which Gen AI might be a good solution. So rather than kind of throw the most complex business problem and say like, hey, let's solve that with Gen AI, the better approach that I've kind of observed is, if you start with something that's more tractable, that's more clearly defined, there's a clear value proposition, you have an ability to kind of measure it in a tangible way, and you also have, let's say, some advocacy from leadership, and you have a predefined set of customers or users for that particular solution. So starting with something that's fairly defined and somewhat narrow in scope is a great way to start, because that gives you the ability to kind of demonstrate the value and also learn from your implementation challenges or your pull through challenges and how to actually finesse that and really achieve the outcomes that you're setting out to achieve. And so once you have that under your belt, you can kind of build on top of that. And so I feel like it's almost like an iterative journey where if you're starting out early enough, like, you start with something small and clearly defined, and then you progress in scale and complexity from there.
How do you also think about, the management of the rapid acceleration of the technology itself, right? So when we think about finding a tangible problem to solve, right? And what is the business value and the output that we're looking for? I think it is a great point to find that one single thread that you can pull on and say, here's value and here's how it can be done really effectively, right? And like you said, identify those pain points in that process so that it can be more of a repeatable pattern. It can be faster, it can be iterative in its nature, but there's also this element of kind of R&D within it as well to say we find that single threaded value, but something that I think you've done really well is you have kind of a dual approach, right? Of we're going to take things to production, we're going to actually see that value, but we're still going to create space for kind of like learning, some research, some development, testing out new theories, and really just evaluating if they even make sense at all, so that when there are questions from leadership, like this is what we want to tackle, can we use X, right? I think like right now it's every single solution because can we use agents, right, to solve that problem that we have right now? If you had asked maybe 6 months ago, it was, can we use RAG to do it? Like it's ever evolving. So, it would be great to have you talk about how you manage those two distinct kind of warring sensibilities of getting something to production that has value, but also continuing to evolve internally.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, Alexis. And I'm sure, from your experience, you've experienced the same thing as well. So in my mind, there's two aspects to this, right? So one is the technology itself is evolving at a very rapid pace, right? And so there is this tension between, hey, do we actually go with what's available today? Or do we just wait for, let's say, another 4 or 5 months when this technology is likely going to change, and then we'll jump back in and try to figure out how to generate solutions there. And I feel like the issue with that is that becomes a never ending game, because this progression of technology and the evolution of technology is going to be constant, right? And so you have to at some point say okay, there is immediate value to be realized in the organization today. And so we will draw a line in the sand and say, hey, let's make sure that we can capitalize on the technology that we have today and generate business value, and also demonstrate this value to leadership. And then if the technology evolves, then we will adapt, right? And so I think that is, a good strategy to follow, because it's not like, what you've done before is wasted work or throwaway work. You've actually learned a lot from that. And you've also helped the organization learn a lot from that. The other aspect to that is, once you've decided, okay, here's a particular solution that, let's say, leverages Gen AI, it's, at least in my experience, it's very rarely the case that you've got everything defined, in terms of how you're gonna solve that particular problem, what sort of Gen AI based techniques you're going to use, what sort of algorithms are appropriate. So none of those are deterministic, or I would say really known upfront, right? And so you still have to have this experimentation mindset where you're trying out various options, you're trying out various solutions in a rapid prototype type of environment, and learning quickly from that to come up with what might be the optimal path in order to solve a particular problem. And then the production process can kind of, as much as possible, happen in parallel to some extent, where you are kind of working on things that are common, or at least have a common thread between your prototyping track and your production track. And so that's the kind of approach that I've seen that works, because you still have to do all of the testing and evaluation to make sure that you actually have a solid solution that you're trying to operationalize. But you also don't want everything to be sequenced in such a way that it takes forever to actually get something in place.
Because hearing you right now reminds me of a couple of broader concepts from a system standpoint. And you're really talking about capacity building through action, right? And so in this process of iterating, you're building capacity, and that involves both knowledge and insights, but also attitudes and in skills and abilities at the organization level. And the attitude is really important because oftentimes you're dealing with large organizations where people are hearing things externally, context. There may be other fears and other concerns regarding job security or privacy and other elements of it. In your view, as you're talking about identifying the first use cases, is the cycle of iteration really important? Meaning, saying let's have a quick win within 5 months, 6 months, so that we can start building that shared language. Part of why we started our company is purely because there's the shared language between clinical teams and research teams and technical teams can be very different. An MVP, for example, can have a very different meaning. So I'd love to hear about your experience and what you've learned and some takeaways that teams can have and what it looks like when we, for example, in our partnership, how do we make that alignment so that the language and shared vision is unified?
Yeah, no, I think what you're trying to get at, Dr. Salim, if I interpret it correctly, is like how do you actually bring the organization along in the journey so that the organization can learn from this, right? So I think to me, at least in my experience, what's been successful is having the organization, or whether it's cross-functional teams or it's even the end users, like brought along in the journey from the get-go. Right, so it's not like AI ML is in the exclusive realm of like the technologists or the data scientists or the machine learning engineers. It's basically a technology that is can unlock significant value and productivity, and so you really have to align the solution design with what is the intended kind of use as well as who's the intended user, right? And so in my experience, bringing the user base proactively into the journey and learning from their pain points and understanding what it is that they're trying to solve in their day-to-day workflow, and then aligning that with the objectives of the AI ML kind of solution goes a long way. And so for most folks, I think you touched on a good point. I think there is a lot of fear, I think in generally in the hype space around AI and ML coming to take your jobs, right? To me, that is a little bit of a distraction in terms of the conversation. So it's really about how can AI ML, help augment what people are doing today, across different organizations and teams, right? And so that should really be the tone of the conversation. And so when you frame it in that context, and then help people kind of understand that this is really a tool that will help them become more effective or more productive, I think that's where there is a lot more adoption and support for it.
And I think there's also something interesting, that we've certainly seen happen is that once you get that first experience in the user's hands, all of a sudden they imagine the possibility is so much broader, right? They can say like, oh, here's what I would love for it to do. Like, I'm thrilled with what you gave me, but what if it could also do this, And there's just this wealth of ideas that are then coming from users themselves. And I think that also does put an interesting additional kind of tension on leadership, and then on the role that you and others who are in your position play as well to kind of manage those expectations. And you mentioned expectations earlier and bringing users along, but it is such an important point around how do we make sure that if we are trying to get things out quickly so that we can evaluate whether or not they have the value we're trying to achieve, it might not be the perfect solution the first time, right? And so how do we set those right expectations for what it's going to look like and how the user can be part of that journey and that evolutionary process of the product itself, while coming up with grandiose ideas and balancing that on a roadmap that you still have to have, right? You can't do everything under the sun. So, I think that's something that we've seen happen, and anything you can share there that you've found has been effective in your role, because I think you sit between that, right? You hear the user feedback, you hear what business wants to do, and you also have this responsibility to the product that is in production right now and is trying to evolve with all of those demands kind of facing it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, and I think that's a constant struggle, and I'm fairly confident that that's a constant struggle across the board, right? So it's not specific.
Yeah, you're not alone, right? Everybody has that.
Yeah, but I think that I think comes with the territory, and it also doesn't help that there's just so much, buzz, so much noise around Gen AI, and then all you see in the news is like, how agentic AI is able to do everything, like cook breakfast for you and this and that, right? And so I think it becomes hard to kind of separate the reality from what is like, the future potential of this technology. And so I think that goes back to like, I think what I was talking about early on, which is, really bringing the user base or your customers in the journey up front, right? And part of that, bringing them into the journey, is really articulating and setting the right expectations, right? And I think as, like data scientists and ML engineers, like we understand the technology a bit more. So we're able to kind of like really assess like what is this technology capable of doing and what are the limitations, right? And so it behooves, I would say, like the technology kind of teams to really proactively articulate and frame it in such a way that the business users or the non-technical audience can really grasp how the technology will actually, or is expected to kind of pan out, right? The other piece of this, which I think is also important, is there needs to be some organizational mind shift as well, right? Which is, it's never going to be perfect, and the journey to perfection, maybe just going on forever, right? So how can you still drive value today with what you have? So like, let's not let perfection be the enemy of good, right? So how can you continue to like leverage the good that is there today and then drive value while, we're making kind of incremental improvements, right? And I think that's again comes back to the framing, in my opinion, because at least from my vantage point, what's really helped is frame this more as like, look, this is, this technology can really be kind of your co-pilot, right? Or your companion of sorts. So it's never going to get you all the way there. Like, you still have to leverage your subject matter expertise. Like, you are the expert that really knows the business, right? You really have to layer on that expertise. The tool only helps you kind of get, let's say, 85-90% of the way there, and then maybe you still have to like go the last 10%, right? And so that framing really kind of, I think, helps, in my opinion, like the non-technical audience kind of grasp the intent of this, right? And so they still feel like they're in the driver's seat, and this is just a complementary tool that allows them to kind of unlock greater value.
I have a question. Looking back, I mean, you've been the AI translator, right? You're bridging these gaps, helping think through concepts and execution, and then identifying what goes through productizing. Do you think, what's the role of education and or having common language for leadership enablement, for the non-technical team enablement? How much of your work do you feel could have been mitigated if there was more of a common understanding on these basic scores? Do you feel like the organizations around the world will start to have programs internally just to build alignments regarding the language, the terms, so that your teams can function more efficiently and effectively? I'm just curious to think of your thoughts regarding patterns you've seen.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a dire gap today, I would say, because I think there still exists this gap, right? I think the language used, the concepts that people are talking about, like from my at least observations, they're very different from if you're talking to a group of data scientists and machine learning engineers. The language used there, doesn't necessarily resonate with the language the business teams are using, right? Even if they may be talking about the common thread here, which is like, how do you use like AI, ML technologies? And so I think having this, at least a common kind of like understanding of what the technology is, what are the key terms, that will greatly help. And I think it's almost like organically we're learning that there is this gap, right? Because we're starting to kind of like utilize Gen AI technologies to unlock enterprise value, but then as we go through the process, we realize that people are talking about different things. And so how do you try to unify that with some sort of a common vocabulary? And so that goes back to like, how do you enable the efficient pull through of these technologies, right? With teams that are focused specifically on onboarding and enablement and training and things like that. But once the organization kind of like, at least gets a little bit of experience with this, I expect to see more proactive, I would say, AI and ML kind of broad awareness sessions, both at the ground level as well as at the leadership level, to actually bridge that gap. And I think from my observations, I've already seen that happening to some extent. And I think that trend and trajectory will continue.
Something that this reminds me of is, at the beginning of the year, which just feels so far ago now, is we did a workshop, right, with the new product. We're building a new one, and we did this whole workshop together. And there were a lot of different threads to it, but one that I walked away with that I thought was so meaningful, and not necessarily gave us this like shared language, but to your point, that it built a framework for us to have a conversation where we could understand what business was saying, we could understand what tech was saying, we could understand even what the users were imagining, what design, like all these pieces were coming together. And if you recall, we did like that whiteboard experiment, right? Like, here's the journey that we're gonna have for this product from end to end. And it was an opportunity to say, if we make a statement that seems simple in nature, it actually isn't as simple when you think about it from the perspective of the data engineer, right, who is most concerned about a database, or you think about it from the perspective of the data scientist who needs ground truth data to feel confident in the output of their model, or the designer who's most concerned about what the user experience is going to be. And it brought together all of these different experiences. And at the end, I think we actually landed in a place where we understood that even the simple things, when we look at leveraging AI and just software engineering in general, can have really complex meanings depending on the perspective you're coming from, and how important it is to have that open dialogue about it, so you can really nail down, like, what are the questions that we have and how do we come to resolution of those, so we build trust in what we're doing, right? And we have those experiences that can be iterative, that can actually have that high value. So I certainly walked away from that thinking, like, this is something that is really effective to bridge some of that gap.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point too. I think, these teams like tend to be so complex and, have a very diverse set of team members, right? I think, and everybody, typically kind of works from their point of view, right? I mean, like you said, the data engineers are mostly concerned about like, how do you generate efficient, data pipelines, right? And how do you engineer like efficient features in those data? And the data scientists are more, concerned about like, what candidate options, do we actually experiment with that we think is going to solve the problem? And then you have machine learning engineers that are trying to optimize the pipelines and then deploy it and so on and so forth. But even then, I think, regardless of like how diverse the teams are in their specific focus areas, I also feel like there needs to be this, again, going back to Dr. Salim's kind of concept of AI translator, I think something to that effect on the technology team as well, right? Someone that can actually put the end-to-end pieces together and think about like how it all connects, right? And what is the larger kind of goal here that we're trying to achieve, right? And so every single piece is really critical, right? So the data engineering part is so critical, the UX piece is so critical, the user, the application design, the front end is so critical. So all of those things have to come together in a cohesive whole without looking like a disjointed set of things that have just been cobbled together. And that's just within the technical team. And then you have to talk to the business and then make sure that they understand how to use the technology and how to actually relay information and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a complex problem, but I think there's plenty of opportunities within this kind of ecosystem to really drive a lot of outcomes.
I love that example because it's a process where you kind of unlock different dimensions of questions, and for every stakeholder, they have their own set of questions potentially. But when it comes together, you realize, wow, together it's actually quite complex. And not that you would fully understand the data engineering questions and why it matters, but you start building an appreciation. You start breaking those silos, right? That oftentimes happens across large organizations. Where you're like, oh yeah, I appreciate why this is complicated. I appreciate the questions that are being asked. But then you also have that overarching individual who's the AI translator who pulls it all together. But I think that's the capacity building at an organizational level, where in that process of discussion and learning, trust emerges, right? It's not an outcome you drive for, but it's a manifestation of a process where people feel like we're all aligned to a common vision of serving a patient. right? Or changing, like whatever that vision is. But it's in that action and that working together, getting to know each other and appreciating each other, which oftentimes is hard to do over email, right? It's more, oftentimes questions in lots of organizations, to be honest, are ways of like delaying, of blocking, right? Work, and it's bureaucracy. With workshops to bring people together, with every stakeholder I've seen, in my experience, has been really transformative in changing the mindset that you mentioned earlier as well, and moving things forward. I think it's underappreciated, and I think in this current culture of a lot of remote work, it's a value or maybe a takeaway I think more companies, more organizations need to do is to have these intentional workshops, especially around AI and the potential of AI in their own context.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, there is just so much that can be unlocked in terms of, creativity, as well as like, going far down like the solutioning process, even if a bunch of people get together in a room and just whiteboard it, right? I think we have seen time and again that, that type of workshop, format and setting really kind of accelerates, the creativity as well as solutioning steps. And to your point, actually builds trust. Like from my own, example, like just reflecting back on when I started this journey. So I come from like a data science and machine learning practitioner background. And so I didn't fully appreciate like all the different pieces that really connect, right? Like how does the infrastructure connect? How do you do like machine learning operations? Like how does UI UX come into the picture? How does like onboarding and training of end users come into the picture? So I didn't really have a good sense of appreciation for all of these things because I was really focused on like, hey, how can I build the best model or the algorithm because I'm a data scientist. But over time, I've seen that how critical these other pieces are, right? And so collectively, they create something that is more than just the sum of their individual components. And that's where the true magic is in terms of realizing either good customer experience or, unlocking business value. And so in-person collaboration, from a position of trust and learning, I think is really, really critical. And that's what I've encouraged my teams to do, and generally seen that tends to be really successful.
And I think that also, enables leaders to open the door more frequently as well. Within that trust environment, right? It can be hard to say, hey, I'm going to let two people run with an idea, right? Like you've got a path for how you could solve this, like go test some things out, right? Maybe it takes a month to figure that out. Depending on how you look at it, a month is either a really long time to try and test something or a really short time, right? And I think if you're sitting in the data scientist block, it's like a month isn't that much time. I need more time, more iteration. But from a leadership perspective, it's like, well, a month is another month we've lost to that decision, right? We've lost to like production launch. And I think having that space where you have trust and where you have that shared understanding of how all the components come together to make a really effective product at the end of the day is really important for the leadership to have as well, because then they can say, sure, like take the time to do that early iteration and that early evolution because they trust the outcome is going to be worth that initial investment. But you can only do that if you have those first experiences where you've all come together to see that that's actually fruitful at the end of the day. It's really hard to build that in a vacuum, right? Where you don't have that shared experience together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Curious, is there I'm gonna put you on the spot here. Think through a implementation failure that you've experienced in the past 20 years of experience, where you've taken the learning and said, hey, yeah, that we didn't do as well as we could have, either because we worked with some people and our relationship was not one based on trust and the accompaniment, it was one on transfer. Do you have a story you can share with us that's or an experience and how that changed your mindset and what you've done differently? Because I know in our experience working together, trust and accompaniment is a core pillar, right? So it's a very different relationship than other relationships, many other experiences, stories you've heard of others have had. And I'm just curious, in this journey from a data scientist to a person who actually owns the kind of full execution of taking something from vision to implementation. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I think I'm just trying to jog my memory. I think I've definitely encountered situations where, I've come with a particular idea and try to kind of implement that. I mean, it's obviously not like an enterprise product level, but something much smaller in scope, but only to realize later that it completely missed the mark, right? And so, I think there's actually a couple of examples I can think about. Like, one particular instance, maybe just to kind of elaborate a bit more. I was trying to come up with some structured outputs utilizing various NLP techniques, like so sentiments, trends, topics, discovering topics from unstructured data, extracting key phrases, summarizing large volumes of text, and so on. So the goal was to kind of come up with these bespoke like functionalities, and then just cobble them together in some sort of a dashboard format, so that the end users can utilize it and consume insights. And so the approach that I had taken was, I identified a very, very broad need that we have a bunch of unstructured data that's coming in, and we just needed to drive insights, and that was it, right? And so I took that to mean like, okay, that's my realm now. So I need to go and build out all of these things and then present this final solution, so to speak. What I ended up doing is, after I built all of this, I then realized, like after talking to users, that the way I had set up this dashboard, which is, you could just like search for something, and then you could like identify some sentiments, you could click on that and then go to, let's say, a negative or a positive sentiment, and then look for topics and things like that. So it meant to be a cascade of all of these functionalities, but it missed the point that was not the way users were trying to tease out insights. And so from a user-based perspective, they had a particular way of looking at these data, and they typically marry these data with some structured data in order to kind of complete that picture. So I fully missed that because I didn't necessarily do my due diligence in terms of like really understanding how users may want to consume it, like what does their workflow look like, and how can I potentially complement that workflow with this solution. So to me, the focus was all about, hey, I can use NLP to drive all of these insights, and so that's where I'm adding value. And so it goes back to like, what I was talking about earlier, which is really understanding your customers' kind of pain points and their current workflow. Like that is absolutely critical. And I would say that's a lot more critical than the most sophisticated algorithm or the model that you can develop, because if it's not aligned to that, then it greatly diminishes value, and it has all kinds of knock-on effects, right? Where it builds distrust. Then users say, hey, this is not what I wanted, and so I don't really trust that this solution or AI can really help, right? And that's really not the case. It's just that the solution was misaligned with what the users were expecting, or it was misaligned with what the users wanted to do. I've learned from those mistakes, and I think looking back on it now, I think making those mistakes was maybe not such a bad thing, because I actually got to like really appreciate what it takes to really align like AI ML technologies with enterprise like goals and business objectives.
I was just thinking, Alexis, I was just thinking at you have a lot of experience. You've been in Genentech for 16, 17 years. Genentech is clearly a company that is ahead of the curve in thinking about AI and data science. There's a lot of different organizations, health systems and other organizations, who are in the early stages of their journey. And, I'm wondering like your thoughts, if you were to give advice to another organization that's early on in this journey, what is the kind of team you'd want to build from different roles, capacities, internally? What are the kind of relationships you want to work with, outside partners, and how would you like manage it? Is there any tips you can give to our audience who are early on the stage, who want to learn from your experience, and are inspired by, taking ideas and translating them into a sustained implementation program? I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I think from my perspective, if let's say some company is just embarking on this journey, it may seem a little bit daunting initially, right? Because you need to have these large technical teams. You need to really have a lot of infrastructure to do some of these things, and then you need to have leadership advocacy. And we talked about like user journeys and really understanding that and so on. And all of that, if you're starting out, can really feel overwhelming, right? And maybe where you want to start may not be all that very clear. And so I think the piece of advice that I would have is, again, goes back to like something I said earlier during the beginning of our conversation, which is really start with something that is small, right? And it doesn't have to be like less utility. Like small doesn't mean less utility. It's small just means that you've kind of clearly defined the scope, and you know that is specific enough that you can actually try to solve it with AI ML, and then measure the impact of it. And that's really critical, because you have to be able to measure it in a tangible way that you can then demonstrate to leadership to say, hey, look, there is value to be realized here. And so that step, I think, is absolutely crucial, right? And so once you've done that, then there is the greater scope for going back to leadership and saying, hey, can we solve more complex problems, right? And so what does that entail? That might require more investments in AI and ML, and more investments in AI ML teams, right? But starting with something small, I mean, you don't really have to wait for a large complex team to be put in place, lots of advocacy to be readily available to you before you even start. So there is plenty of opportunity to start in a very small way, but in a very tangible and measurable way, and then iteratively build on top of it. And I'm a huge proponent of that, and I think that's the kind of journey that I've been on as well, like during all of my tenure. And I've seen that be a good strategy to kind of adopt, because that kind of brings everybody along in a very systematic way into the AI ML fold, and which is the right way to kind of scale it. Then your point about the external kind of partners, I think that's again very crucial, I would say. So not all of the expertise may be available in-house, right? And so leveraging the expertise of external partners, subject matter experts, or even AI ML like technology experts is again very, very crucial, because they fill a critical gap that you don't quite have in-house. And so that partnership becomes absolutely critical to kind of deploying any type of AI ML solutions at the enterprise level.
And when you think back to what has let you and your team be really effective in the role that you all play in this kind of intersection, right, of all the pieces and all the other teams that are working around it, what has been most important for you to get from that leadership team, right? I know there is this like back and forth where we need to help translate information so they can feel comfortable at what is possible, what is being built, et cetera. But what do you need most from them? What has been most effective to enable you to do the best job you possibly can in your team to be really effective?
Yeah, if I were to boil that down to one word, Alexis, like that would be
impressive. You can do that.
Yeah, no, I think trust would be the most important thing, right? Because I think I've greatly benefited from my leadership, chain, fully trusting what I'm trying to do. And I think that goes back to company culture as well, right? I think when you're hiring people in these specialized roles like data science or machine learning, etc., you have to be able to trust that they know their stuff, right? And they're trying to do their best. And so starting from a place of trust is very, very critical. The second piece I would say is, advocacy to drive change, right? So I think when you want to think about, let's say, implementing AI and ML at the enterprise level, it represents, or it actually presents quite a bit of an organizational change management problem, right? And so it's not just about the technology piece, it's also like the workflows have to change, the people have to adapt to the new ways of working and things like that. And so having that advocacy be vocal and from a leadership standpoint is also very, very helpful, because that basically sets the direction for the rest of the organization that, hey, this is something that we really want to do because we sincerely believe that there is a lot of value to be unlocked here. And so that incentivizes a lot of the teams to really embrace the technology and also adapt it, in a more intrinsic way to what the teams are actually doing, right? And so having that trust first, and then also the top-down advocacy for driving change with AI ML. They're absolutely critical.
Yeah, and I think we've actually, I know we were talking about this earlier this week, but like we've seen that play out pretty effectively, right? In this, in one particular project that we were thinking of, where it's something net new. There is clear advocacy from the leadership team of like, we need to get this done. It's going to be potentially a long road to get to the ideal state that we want to be at, but we need to start somewhere, and we're going to start somewhere now, and we need to make incremental progress that is meaningful incremental progress, even if it's not going to be perfect on that first iteration. But within that space then of this advocacy, there is then trust for the teams to actually figure out the nuance of that themselves, right? And to work together collaboratively and have open dialogue about what makes the most sense to actually achieve in a first phase versus a second phase, even if sometimes that's not the ideal outcome for any one team, right? It's how do we all kind of balance each other to get to that state so that, a year down the road or 6 months down the road, even a better state, it's always improving. And I know you've talked about iteration a lot, right? It's always that iterative cycle, and you want to have that be really productive, both early on in your development process and your discovery process, but even when something is in production, being iterative in that. And you're so right. It really is foundational to have that trust component and that advocacy to create that space to do that important work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit on a really good point as well, Alexis. I think it's worth, double clicking into, or at least doubling down on, which is the whole idea of like AI ML implementation by design is an iterative process, right? And I don't think that that concept is necessarily what everyone either knows about or believes, right? So I think there is this tendency to say, hey, it's a one-time, like, let's just apply this general purpose technology to this problem. So everything at that point becomes like, different and it's all great. Like it rarely happens that way, right? I think even though you may have the right application, you still have to iterate to refine it to the point where it actually starts delivering value. And so that can be a pretty hard concept for some of the folks to grasp, because that requires like, working and being comfortable with things not being perfect, so that you can give that feedback and then go through this process of refinement again. And so it does take time. And so having, letting the experts kind of, do what they're doing and having trust in that is again, something that I've seen that works very well from leadership perspective, because this whole iteration, essentially means that the first time around it's not going to be good, right? And so you have to provide that feedback, and you have to be patient that the next time around is going to be slightly better. And so that process is what gets you to like really unlock business value, and that has to be communicated proactively as well.
Yeah, and it's such an important point. Something companies kind of have to learn as well, because something we talked about loosely, right, is there's a lot of buzz often about AI, machine learning, what can be done, but you never see the failures on the path to that success, right? They're going to announce it when it's successful and they want you to use it. They're not going to tell you that it took 6 months to develop and maybe they went down 3 wrong paths before they actually got to the end result that produced what they needed it to do. And so companies have to remind themselves, right, that like this is a pattern that we also need to internalize, and we need to support, and we need to nurture, because the companies that are really successful with producing them is doing it. They're just not highlighting that part of it, right? They're highlighting that end result, but it is such an important element for sure.
Yeah, love it.
What's incredible to me is how much of this conversation is about trust. And I recently had this wonderful discussion with some friends of mine regarding that trust is not what we drive for. It occurs when we practice trustworthiness. So as an organization, we're focused on the consistent practice of being trustworthy, which is our actions are just, and what we say, communicate is consistent, and that emerges over time, right? And that it's a mindset that ties to a learning posture as well, right? The iteration part of it is like, look, we're gonna learn, you're being transparent what we don't know and what we do know, right? And that practice has to be a mindset that everyone has to have. And so for us as an organization, that's our posture and mindset. When we work with partners who have the similar mindset, that's where the magic happens. Oftentimes, there's been experiences where there can be 2 different philosophies, right? You come to an organization that hasn't been practicing trustworthiness, that isn't about focus on learning, and it's about if you make a mistake, it's a failure that is harmful to your career, And I think that's something that leadership has to recognize, that that's a key component, as well as the technical side, where building the right infrastructure to enable your data scientists is important. Also, the mindset you mentioned earlier, a mindset that is about learning, about practicing, trustworthiness, which means their actions and words consistent, and finding partners in that same realm to develop that ecosystem to move things forward. I think that's a huge element that is missed. Too often I think about people say, oh, change management, which is not it's not the same idea as enabling a culture of learning and trust that will allow us to use AI, because there's a lot of unknowns on AI, right? There's privacy concerns, there's security concerns. Agents now are unlocking a capability that's amazing, but there's a lot of other questions that come arise. And if we can't get alignment of the compliance teams, legal teams, the medical affairs teams, the research teams, in having trust, trustworthiness being practiced, it's going to really hinder the progression. And I'm just doubling down on, your position, your natural ability as a leader to bring about trustworthiness in the organization. I recognize that, and that's one of the reasons we've, really find the like-mindedness in how we operate and work together.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love that, Dr. Salim. I think I really loved how you framed it, which is, you can't really demand trust. You can't really drive trust, just by edict, right? I think you have to embody and then, practice trustworthiness as a behavior, and that organically kind of spawns trust within teams. I really love that. I think, that's so well articulated. And I think I might actually steal that, for my general purpose, conversations with my team. Yeah.
Well, it emerges from practice, right? And working together. I think a key component is reflection, right? And that's one of the things we oftentimes talk about in our organization, is how do we reflect on what we've done and take that humble posture, right? And I think these are the key elements of building durable relationships, right? And durable impact around that. In the couple of minutes we have left, there's a couple of questions coming from the audience. I'd love to be able to address them. There's a question coming from the audience, and the question is, with the rise of LLMs, in your opinion, where does classical ML still hold strong relevance in enterprise settings?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, that's so timely as well, because, if you see just the hype that surrounds LLMs and agents, it almost makes you feel like, you have to throw LLMs and agents at every single problem, right? And that's really, in my experience, not the way to go. I think you have to be very, very thoughtful about what is the right application of LLMs, what is the right application of even agentic AI, right? In a lot of cases, you may not even need an agentic system, right? When a simple kind of LLM-based workflow will suffice. Regarding classical machine learning, I think there is still a lot of applicability of classical machine learning, because a lot of the data tends to be structured. You have to kind of look at classification or regression type problems. I mean, those are still a lot of pressing problems that organizations face. And so to me, it's not really classical machine learning versus let's say Gen AI. It's really complementary, right? I think where there are use cases and business needs where the right solution to deploy is a classical machine learning algorithm, either because of cost or because of time or because of infrastructure related issues. And you can still go very, very far with those. And then with Gen AI and agentic AI, I think it has to be, again, tailored specifically to the right use cases where you're really kind of demonstrating, the value and balancing some unpredictability as well as some non-deterministic kind of behaviors that come with using agentic AI and things like that, right? So, and I think from my vantage point as an enterprise, we use both, right? We use both extensively for very tailored and specific use cases.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I think it ties into the second question. I'll bubble as our last question here. It's about how do we decide when to build a custom model versus an off-the-shelf solution like GPT? Or how do you decide? Yes, that's the question. I think you alluded to it a little bit of it.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. it would again go back to, in my opinion, like what is the benefit versus, what are the trade-offs, right, that you're making. I mean, developing, let's say, something like a foundation model is not easy. Like, it's technically very complex, it's prohibitively expensive, right? And the value proposition may not even be there, right? So I think you have to really think through, like, what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and then can you actually solve it off-the-shelf models, right? I mean, there are techniques like, retrieval augmented generation, prompt augmentation, reflection, and things of that sort that you can actually do in order to imbue the off-the-shelf model with your domain context, right? And that can get you really, really far. And there may be like edge cases, like, in the case of medical domain, where you really want the model to be trained with all of the medical terminologies and have like intrinsic clinical knowledge about certain therapeutic areas and things of that sort. Like, that's when I think your off-the-shelf model may not fully hit the mark, right? And so you have to identify those specific use cases where it actually makes sense to try and fine-tune some of these models to your domain-specific data, or go with, let's say, something that you want to build from scratch, which may be on a much smaller scale.
I recently was telling someone that there's over 900,000 models on Hugging Face, and just blows your mind, right? To think there's 900,000 models, something like 300,000 data sets. I mean, there's an ocean of models to choose from, and I think so. It's not a trivial question of which model to use, efficiency, like what you're trying to do, and there's a level of expertise and know-how that's critical in that process. We're at time, and I would love to, if you have any closing comments or thoughts that you want to share with the audience, so takeaways, I'd love to hear them now.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one last comment that I'll make is, like, I think this is an exciting time to be on this journey of AI ML. I think the possibilities are, really very promising and really exciting, and also somewhat unpredictable, like in terms of where this technology is going to go. So if you're looking to kind of, utilize like AI ML in your enterprise, or you're just, let's say, starting out on your journey to learn AI ML as a data scientist or as a machine learning engineer, like, this is absolutely a great time to be a part of that journey. So I would say, just go dive both feet in, and then, have fun along the way, and then the opportunities seem limitless at this point.
Well, Santosh, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been a great pleasure just hearing your thoughts here and being able to work with you and your team. And we just really, really appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone who's joined us online and those on the webinar for joining us. And Alexis, thank you as well, because you've been a key factor in building those relationships and helping us in implementing, working with our different partners. So thank you again for joining us. And until next time, we will be talking soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. I had a wonderful time, talking with you both, and so really appreciate, and looking forward to working together on other projects.